Hello, my dear students, and to those who are interested in the field of industrial organizational psychology. I will be giving a brief overview of what is industrial psychology, its history, and the trends of industrial organizational psychology. But before that, have you ever wondered what motivates people to work? How organization functions and deliver goods and services? How the best candidates are selected? How do good leaders prosper? So if you are thinking about this, you are talking like an industrial organizational psychologist. Industrial organizational psychology is a branch of psychology that deals with the behavior of people in work setting and the application of psychology principles to change work behaviors. What do industrial organizational psychologists typically do? So for those who are planning to pursue this kind of field, here are the areas where industrial organizational psychologists work in. One of the big area is the selection and placement. So industrial organizational psychologists develop the test, they validate the test in order to recruit new members of the organization or a prospect applicant or employee. And the next area, a heavy area, is the training and development. So the IO psychologists, they are the one who identify the training needs, they conduct the training, they evaluate the training efficiency. So if the training of an organization works, so it is the task of an IO psychologist to determine the training or the effectiveness of the training. Another heavy area that an industrial organizational psychologist work in is the organizational development or the OD. So IO psychologists are the one who plans and facilitate what needed to be changed inside the organization. Also, the IO psychologists, they analyze the structure of the organization. So the culture, the background, or the structure of the organization. So another important area is the performance management. The IO psychologists are the one who are hired to perform, to measure the performance of the employees, conduct performance appraisal, develop performance appraisal system, or even to help reduce the harmful measures of performance. Another big area is the quality of work life. So in this area, the IO psychologists determine how to reduce stress, how to increase job satisfaction, or anything to improve the quality of an employee or the working life of an employee. Another area is the human factors, or we call this now the ergonomics. IO psychologists in this field will study how to fit work environment to people. Also in this field is to help create a safe workplace or a safety culture. So those are the different areas where industrial organizational psychologists work. So if you're planning to pursue this field, then go for it because it is one of the emerging field in psychology. So what is the I and O all about? Diba? We have the IO psychology or industrial organizational psychology. So these are two big words. They are different but they are interrelated. There are some difference between the I and O, but they cannot exist without the other. The industrial side of IO psychology, the I side, it focuses more on the human relations or the HR realm. So they cover things like recruitment, training, promotion, testing, performance appraisal, promotion, or even the transfer or the termination of a job. The industrial side also focuses on how people are different or the individual differences of the people. The O side is much more interested in the emotional side of work. So how is it that the employees respond to work itself in terms of motivation, different attitudes, leadership, stress, different teams, and job designs, and anything that deals with the organization as a whole. So we have differentiated the I and O in the IO psychology. So let's go on to the one of the fundamental aspect of industrial organizational psychology. One of the fundamental aspects of industrial psychologists is that they follow the scientist-practitioner model. IO solves real problems. So problems like sexual harassment, discrimination inside the workplace, gender bias, bullying. So industrial organizational psychologists deal it inside the workplace. In other words, there is a clear connection between the research done by an IO psychologist and the issues of work. Although IO followed the model, not every single person who is a researcher is an applied practitioner. And also not every researcher is a practitioner or scientist. But there is a very clear connection between the research done by an IO psychologist and its application. That's why the IO psychologist is called a scientist practitioner. So we all know the distinction between the I and O in psychology, the scientist practitioner model. So let's go on to the roots of industrial psychology. Some of you will be saying why we have to study history. This is not a history class. And yes, you're right. But there are some reasons. And the main reason is that we really can't understand how we got to where we are in the field today unless we don't look back to where we came from. In the beginning, the roots of industrial organizational psychology can be traced back to the technical origins of psychology itself, which is the founding of the first psychological laboratory by Wilhelm Wundt in 1976. And Wundt trained two forefathers of IO psychology, Hugo Munsterberg and James McKeen Cattell. So Munsterberg, he was the first to measure abilities and tie them to performance. He was the first to use basic statistics to analyze results. He was an experimental psychologist who became interested in the design of work and personal selection for jobs, such as streetcar operator. In addition, he wrote the first industrial organizational psychology textbook. He was considered by many as the father of industrial psychology because he pioneered the application of psychological findings from laboratory experiments to practical matters. James McKeen Cattell was the first to study individual differences and look at how they predict behaviors. He was the first to measure mental abilities and tell us how well the people would perform in other areas. And this was a huge breakthrough at the moment because people like Wundt were only really interested to the general laws of behavior. They were interested in what ways everyone was the same. And James McKeen Cattell came in and said that, no, people are different, and these differences relate to different outcomes. And that's one of the fundamental premises that we use in IO psychology to test people and select employees. So he at the time was quite opposite at what other people thought. Instead of looking at individual differences as error as Wilhelm Wundt and others did, he looked at them as being important and in and out of themselves. At about the same time, Walter Dill Scott and Walter Van Dyke Bingham came along, and these two gentlemen revised a very well-known intelligence test called the Stanford-Binet that was used to test one person at a time. And what they did is they turned it into a mass test that was suitable for testing many people all at once during World War I. And that time, they were really looking to classify people for that war into different job classifications. And this Stanford-Binet was revised to test match people all at once and was called the Army Alpha. So later we will talk about this kind of test. Walter Dill Scott was an experimental psychologist who pioneered the field of industrial psychology, who was interested in studying salespersons and the psychology of advertising. Scott went on to become the first professor in this new field and started a consulting company to practice what was being learned from research. Another early spark that helped ignite the field of IO psychology was provided not by a psychologist, but by an engineer named Frederick W. Taylor. Taylor believed that scientific principles could be applied to the study of work behavior to help increase worker efficiency and productivity. He felt that there was one best method for performing a particular job. By breaking the job down scientifically into measurable component movements and recording the time needed to perform each movement, Taylor believed that he could develop the fastest, most efficient way of performing any task. He was quite successful in applying his methods, which became known as time and motion studies. These time and motion procedures often doubled, tripled, and even quadrupled labor output. Taylor's system for applying scientific principles to increase work efficiency and productivity eventually became known as the scientific management. In addition to applying time and motion procedures, Taylor incorporated into his system of scientific management other considerations such as selection of workers based on abilities and the use of proper tools. Time and motion studies procedures in which work tasks are broken down into simple component movements and the movements timed to develop a more efficient method for performing the task. Scientific management begun by Frederick Taylor, a method of using scientific principles to improve the efficiency and productivity of jobs. So let's talk another group of people. Here is Lillian and Frank Gilbreths. The book doesn't talk much about these folks, but I always thought they were extremely influential in the formation of our field of industrial organizational psychology. Lillian and Frank was a husband and wife with an interesting story. Lillian was the first person to ever receive a PhD in IO psychology in the year 1917. She and her husband studied and implemented the scientific management of Frederick Taylor. What they did was they had these studies where they would break down every single movement of a particular job or task that was necessary to perform an action at work. For example, they studied bricklayers, and what they would do would list out every single motion that took to perform the length of the bricks. They did this to reduce workers' fatigue and, of course, increase productivity and efficiency. And with their work, they were able to reduce the movements of bricklayer from 18 movements to only 4. Of course, they had a reason for being interested in efficiency because these folks had 12 children and wanted to run their home very smoothly. So they did was they broke down the individual motions of work and actually called them terrible legs, which is Gilbreths spelled backwards. Scientific management principles and procedures such as time and motion studies greatly improve the efficiency of a wide variety of typical types of jobs, including cabinet making, clerical filing, lumber sawing, and the making of reinforced concrete slabs. So they increased 80 to 425 slabs per day.
In the first decades of the century, America was speeding up. Photography not only documented America's growing industrial might, it was put to work as a tool of the modern assembly line. In this speeded-up world, factory owners looked to the camera to make their workers move even faster.
Frank Bunker Gilbreth took his first step into the field of management in 1885 when, on his second day as an apprentice bricklayer, he questioned why he was being taught several different methods for laying bricks. His interest in finding the best method led to his development of motion and fatigue study.
Early in the century, Frank Gilbreth used photographs to break a worker's every action into the smallest units, revealing every unnecessary movement. He studied the fastest workers in order to teach maximum efficiency to everyone. In Gilbreth's cyclograph technique, he attached flashing lights to a worker's fingers to indicate the length of time a motion would take. Soon Gilbreth's photographs were changing the lives of everyone from golfers to oyster shuckers. Gilbreth observed that surgeons took more time looking for their instruments than they did in performing the operation itself. He suggested a new procedure. Keeping an eye on the incision, the surgeon would extend an open palm to the nurse and utter the now famous words, "Scalpel, please." Some accused Gilbreth of turning skilled workers into robots, but the bosses loved his techniques. Gilbreth even brought his zeal for efficiency to his own large family. His children got their revenge when they wrote about home life with their eccentric father and called it cheaper by the dozen. Gilbreth died of a heart attack at age 55.
Unfortunately, these principles cannot be applied today. Unlike in the past, most of the jobs require manual labor. Today, jobs are more complex and often require sophisticated problem-solving skills or the use of creative thinking. Fewer and fewer people engage in physical labor. Many of these higher-level tasks are not amenable to time and motion studies. In other words, there is probably not one best method for creating computer software, developing an advertising campaign, or managing people. It is important to emphasize that scientific management and I/O psychology are not directly connected. Although the principles of scientific management did have an influence on the development of I/O psychology. Today, industrial engineers carry on the tradition of scientific management in efforts to improve the efficiency of jobs. Although work efficiency and increased productivity are certainly important to industrial organizational psychologists, I/O psychology looks beyond efficiency to examine the impact of work procedures and conditions on the working person. At the outbreak of World War I, Gilbreths, who was the president of the American Psychological Association, and a group of psychologists worked with the U.S. Army to create intelligence tests for the placement of Army recruits. The Army Alpha and Beta test represented the first mass testing efforts and set the stage for future testing efforts. Even today, employee testing and selection is an important area of I/O psychology. Following World War I, psychologists began to involve in the screening and placement of personnel in industry. Throughout the 1920s, while the US was experiencing tremendous industrial growth, industrial psychology began to take hold. The first doctoral degree in industrial psychology was awarded in 1921. And psychologists work directly with industries as consultants and researchers. It was also in the 1920s that the first psychological consulting organizations began. Walter Dill Scott opened a short-lived personnel consulting firm in 1919, and the Psychological Corporation was founded by James McKin-Cattell in 1921. Today, consulting organizations offer their services to business and industry. In fact, the difficult economic times in the early part of the 21st century led to organizational downsizing, and many larger organizations that employed I/O psychologists in-house eliminated those positions and now outsourced their work to consulting firms. As a result, consulting firms are thriving and are a major place of employment for I/O psychologists. As the U.S. economy slumped during the 1930s, there was less opportunity for industrial psychologists to work with the industries and businesses. Although industrial psychology continued to grow at a slower pace, an important development came out of this period from a group of Harvard psychologists who were conducting a series of experiments at a manufacturing plant of the Western Electric Company in Hawthorne, Illinois. Researcher Elton Mayo and his colleagues wanted to study the effects of the physical work environment on worker productivity. In the most famous of the experiments, Mayo explored the effects of lighting on worker productivity. Focusing on a group of women who were assembling electrical relay switching devices, he systematically varied the level of illumination in the room. He expected to be able to determine the optimal level of lighting for performing the task. However, the results were surprising and dramatically changed psychologists' view of the worker from then on. No matter what the level of lighting was set at, productivity increased. When lighting was increased, worker output went up. Further increase to very light illumination resulted in further improvement. Turning the lights down even to such low levels that it appeared that the women were working in moonlight also led to increase in productivity. There was a steady increase in workers' output following any change in lighting. In other studies, Mayo systematically varied the length and timing of work breaks. Longer breaks, shorter breaks, more or fewer breaks all resulted in a steady increase in worker output. Mayo knew that every change in the work environment could not possibly be causing the steady rises in worker productivity. Something else had to be affecting output. Upon closer examination, he concluded that the workers were being affected not by the changes in the physical environment, but by the simple fact that they knew they were being observed. According to Mayo, these workers believed that the studies were being conducted in an effort to improve work procedures, and their positive expectations, coupled with their knowledge of the observations, seemed to Mayo to determine their consistent increase in productivity, a phenomenon that has been labeled the Hawthorne effect. Although in the first example discovered by Mayo, the Hawthorne effect was positive, resulting in increased productivity, this was not always the case. In another of his studies, work group productivity fell following the introduction of changes in the work environment. Because these workers believed that the results of the studies would lead to more demanding production quotas, they restricted output whenever they were being observed, thus producing a negative Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect changes in behavior occurring as a function of participants' knowledge that they are being observed and their expectations concerning their role as research participants. These research studies open up a whole new areas of exploration lasting more than a decade into such factors as the quality and nature of supervision, informal groups among workers, employee attitudes toward their jobs, communication, and a host of other social, psychological forces now recognized as capable of influencing, even determining a worker's efficiency, motivation, and job satisfaction. Although the Hawthorne studies have been criticized for their lack of scientific rigor, there is no denying their impact on the way in which the nature of work came to be viewed and on the direction of industrial psychology itself. Human Relations Movement, a movement based on the studies of Elton Mayo that emphasizes the importance of social factors in influencing work performance. World War II also contributed greatly to the growth of IO psychology. First, the tremendous need for state-of-the-art machinery and the increasing complexity of that machinery was an important impetus for human factor psychology and for training soldiers to operate equipment. Second, IO psychologists were called on to improve selection and placement of military personnel, continuing the work that psychologists had begun during World War I. The Army General Classification Test, a group-administered pencil and paper test, was developed to separate recruits into categories based on their abilities to learn military duties and responsibilities. Screening tests were also created to select candidates for officer training. First trend, the changing nature of work. Jobs and organizations are rapidly changing and evolving. Organizations are becoming flatter with fewer levels in the hierarchy, and they are being broken up into smaller subunits with greater emphasis on work teams. With telecommuting, advanced communication systems, and sophisticated networking, people can work in almost any location, with team members who are quite remote. So especially in these pandemic times, almost if not all of the work are now in the computer or they are doing telecommuting. This will have important implications for how work is done. An IO psychologist will be very involved in helping workers adapt to technological and structural changes. In addition, IO psychologists will assist organizations in redesigning jobs for greater efficiency, in creating new and more flexible organizational structures and work teams, and in helping workers become more engaged, motivated, and better able to deal with stresses that result from all the changes. Many jobs are becoming increasingly complex due to technological advancements, and they are more demanding, requiring workers to process more and more information and to make more decisions. Especially now, if you are not a computer literate, then you will have a hard time in this telecommuting or having online classes. In addition, organizations worldwide are reducing their workforces. Organizational downsizing is a strategy for reducing an organization's workforce to improve organizational efficiency, productivity, and/or competitiveness. Organizations are downsizing because of technological advancements such as robotic and computer-assisted manufacturing that eliminate workers' jobs, because of increased efficiency in jobs and the elimination of overlapping worker functions, and because of general reduction in the middle-level managers. In addition, economic downturns such as the economic meltdown in the 2007 to 2008 tend to increase the number of laid-off workers. Moreover, catastrophic events can affect certain industries such as the September 11, 2001 terrorist hijackings and airliner crashes that caused the immediate downsizing of nearly all U.S. commercial airlines. How much more? Remember 2020 when this coronavirus disease affected millions of people, including their jobs. So this event now is very catastrophic, especially for the workforce. Downsizing requires organizations to do more with less to survive, including the fact that fewer workers are doing more work. This trend toward leaner workforces has negative consequences for workers who are required to do more and can create a sense of job insecurity. Organizational downsizing is a strategy for reducing an organization's workforce to improve organizational efficiency and/or competitiveness. So many company or organization are doing this because of pandemic. Research evidence shows that some of the changes in the nature of work, such as telecommuting, increased mobility of U.S. workers, and organizational downsizing, have led to decreased levels of worker loyalty and commitment to organization. Increasing worker engagement and reducing employee turnover are areas in which IO psychologists can help organizations, as we shall see. Another trend is outsourcing of work. Contracting with an external organization to accomplish tasks that were previously done or could be done within the organization. Outsourcing is used to increase output and can reduce overhead costs associated with the personnel needed to do the task in-house. IO psychologists are involved in helping to understand the effect that the increased use of outsourcing is having on variables such as the way jobs are conducted, group processes, structure and design of organizations, employee commitment, motivation, and other factors. So it is used when you have a limited budget. So you outsource other worker from the other company. So diba, in that way, you can save money. And then another trend, the second trend is the expanding focus on human resources. The increasing concern with the management and maintenance of an organization's human resources that began with Mayo and the human relations movement continues to be important. Organizations have become more and more concerned about and responsive to the needs of workers. At the same time, organizations are realizing that skilled and creative workers are the keys to success. The term talent management is a frequent buzzword heard in organizations, important because it reflects the emphasis on the value of the worker and the need to select, care for, and develop workers' talents. This will become even more important in the future. The technological age of the past few decades has seen a tight labor market for truly skilled workers, particularly in high-tech industries. This means that organizations will have to compete ferociously to attack and keep the best workers. The greater emphasis will need to be given to such areas as employee recruitment and selection procedures. Companies will also have to offer more enticing benefit programs to attract and retain the best workers, including family-friendly policies such as employer-sponsored childcare and extended family leaves. In addition, continuing advancement in work technology and the ever-increasing body of knowledge needed by workers to perform their jobs mean that older workers will be retained often to remain contributing members of the workforce. In addition, the US and much of Europe are facing an increasingly aging workforce and relatively fewer young people entering the workforce. All of this suggests that the need for greater focus on personal issues such as recruiting, screening, and testing potential workers, and on employee training, development, and compensation programs, all of which are specialties of IO psychologists. Whereas the skilled labor force is dwindling, the number of low-skilled jobs in the service industry is growing, as is the population of low and unskilled workers. A human resource challenge for the future is to help provide meaningful and rewarding work experiences in these positions and to help transition workers from the unskilled to skilled labor force. Finally, research in IO psychology is beginning to focus more broadly, seeing the worker as a whole person rather than just a working being. IO psychology is looking more and more at individual development, addressing topics such as the process by which workers become engaged in their work, how they cope with stress and adapt to change, and understanding the role of emotions in the workplace. IO psychology has also recognized the overlap between employees' work life and home life, that issues at home can spill over into the workplace and vice versa. The third trend, increasing diversity and globalization of the workforce. Immigration, the increase in global organizations, and the increasing number of women entering the organizational workforce has led to greater and greater workplace diversity. This diversity will only increase in the future. Women and ethnic minorities who have been targets of employment discrimination now make up the majority of the U.S. workforce, and there are similar trends worldwide. Moreover, the diversity of cultures in workplaces will also increase as workers become more internationally mobile. For example, in one Washington, D.C. hotel, workers speak 36 languages and 65% foreign-born and serve an even more diverse clientele. Workforces will continue to consist of members from greater number and variety of cultures. In addition, it has been suggested that there are many different layers or levels examining cultures and cultural differences. Although increased diversity presents challenges to organizations and managers, this increased workforce diversity also represents a tremendous strength and opportunity. An obvious advantage of increased workforce diversity is the opportunity for different viewpoints and perspectives that will lead to organizational creativity and innovation. Increased workforce diversity can help an organization in understanding and reaching new markets for products or services. An organization's commitment to diversity can also help in recruiting and retaining the best workers. For instance, cutting-edge companies that value workforce diversity not only attract the most qualified workers, but also the valuing of diversity permeates the entire organizational culture, leading to reduced organizational conflict, greater cooperation among workers, and increased flexibility and innovation. Industrial organizational psychologists will have to assist organizations in dealing with the challenges increasing diversity will bring. Although diversity has benefits, demographic and cultural differences can, if not carefully managed, create great difficulties in the functioning of work teams, increasing destructive conflict, inhibiting team cooperation, and impeding performance. The key to dealing successfully with diversity will involve getting beyond the surface issues that divide people and getting at the deeper benefits that diversity brings. In the past several decades, there has been a rapid continuing shift toward the more global economy. Businesses and industries worldwide are focusing more and more on the global market. Companies that were formerly concerned only with domestic markets and competition must now consider the international picture. As more and more organizations go international, there is an increasing need for workers to be trained for working in or with organizations located in other countries. The successful executive or manager of the future must be globally aware, knowledgeable and respectful of other cultures, and capable of working with people from a wide variety of backgrounds. And the fourth trend is the increasing relevance of IO psychology in policy and practice. Although IO psychology has had an important impact in how we select, train, develop, and motivate employees, there is a huge potential for IO psychology to play an even bigger part in helping to improve work performance and make the conditions for workers better, more rewarding, and more healthy. It has been suggested that IO psychology could have been a tremendous future impact on the workplace, and that it is critical that research in IO psychology be directly relevant to the practice of IO psychology. Cascio and Aguinis 2008 suggests a number of workplace and social issues and questions that should be addressed by IO psychology in the future. So these include selecting and developing better organizational leaders, including the leaders who are ethical and socially responsible, improving the lot of workers through fair compensation, flexible work policies, and reducing discrimination in the workplace. Leveraging workforce diversity and globalization in optimal ways. Improving performance through optimal management and development of talent, and helping organizations and the people in them to embrace positive change and be more innovative. So that's all for the history of industrial psychology and the trends of industrial organizational psychology. So for those who are aspiring to become an industrial organizational psychology, then you have a knowledge now on what work or what are the areas that industrial organizational psychology do. So see you on my next lesson, and please answer the questions in the comment box. Thank you. Bye.